He thought his dog was just leading him through the desert, but she kept returning to the same saguaro cactus every day, and only when he cut it open did he understand what she was trying to show him. Look what the desert had been hiding for 40 years. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The desert always carried its own kind of silence, a silence that did not simply fill the air, but settled into the bones, into the space between thoughts, into the parts of a person they tried hardest to keep quiet. For Ethan Blake, that silence was both a companion and a test. It reminded him of the places he had survived and the people who hadn't. It reminded him of the nights abroad, when he lay awake listening to distant gunfire, and of the mornings when no sound, except his own breath, told him he was still alive. But here, in the San Marino desert, the silence took on a different shape. It was older, wider, patient in a way that felt almost sentient. And in this place, on the outskirts of a life he was trying to build from the pieces that war had left him, Ethan found himself walking the familiar route he had carved out weeks ago, his black German shepherd Raven trotting steadily at his side. The sun was still low enough that the heat had not yet begun pressing down on the sand. Long shadows stretched from the saguaro giants, their ribs catching the early light in shades of pale gold. Ethan walked with the careful, balanced gait of someone whose body remembered training even when his mind tried not to. His steps were steady, but each movement carried the echo of old injuries, the stiff twinge in his left knee, the faint pull in his shoulder where shrapnel had once grazed bone. He no longer tried to pretend the aches would ever disappear. They were part of him, as much as the memories he didn't talk about, and the instincts that never shut down. Raven moved slightly ahead, ears pricking at every shift in the wind. She was a large dog, lean, muscled, her black coat absorbing the morning light. But there was a softness in her eyes that Ethan trusted more than he trusted most people. She had the discipline of a trained military dog, but none of the cold detachment. Her loyalty was not just learned. It was earned during the day Ethan had pulled her out from beneath a collapsed concrete wall overseas. She had been trembling, wounded, barely breathing, and he had carried her for miles, even while his own squad was screaming for him to keep moving. He had chosen her then, without hesitation, and in the years since, she had chosen him in every way that mattered. Now she sniffed the dry air, tail low, alert but calm. Ethan studied the stretch of desert ahead, cataloging the details the way he always did. Recent animal tracks crossing the trail, the faint shift in the sand that suggested a coyote had passed in the night, the thin crack along a distant rock that hadn't been there a week ago. These small, nearly invisible signs grounded him. They were different from the signs he had once studied abroad, the dragged footprints of a hostile scout, the strange stillness before an ambush, but they activated the same part of his mind that needed order, pattern, awareness. The landscape felt infinite, yet strangely intimate. The desert smelled of creosote and warm stone, the scent drifting across the wind like a memory older than any human who had walked these lands. Ethan breathed it in, letting it settle into him. This place didn't demand that he heal. It didn't require him to forget. It simply existed, vast and unchanged, allowing him to move within it on his own terms. They walked deeper into the quiet, following a faint path between boulders, shaped by centuries of sandstorms. Raven paused occasionally to investigate the trail's edges, nose brushing the ground, before resuming her steady pace. It wasn't until they reached the edge of a shallow wash, a dry riverbed carved long ago, that Ethan felt a subtle shift in her behavior. Her posture changed, sharpening. Her ears flattened slightly, and a low rumble formed in her throat. Ethan stopped immediately. He knew that sound. It wasn't aggression. It was warning. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, his voice low. Raven took 2 steps forward and then stopped, staring intensely at something just beyond a cluster of saguaros. Ethan followed her gaze and saw it. One cactus towering above the rest, easily over 6 meters tall, its age obvious from its thick base and weathered arms. At first glance it seemed like any other, but something about its lower trunk caught his attention. A bulge, large, irregular, and too geometrically shaped to be a natural deformity, rose from the side of the cactus. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That's not normal. Raven circled the cactus with slow, tense steps, her body angled protectively toward him. Her tail was stiff, her nose twitching rapidly, as if she sensed something buried beneath the desert's quiet. Ethan approached carefully. Years of training had wired him to trust his environment only after confirming its safety. He stopped a meter from the cactus, crouching to inspect the strange formation. The bulge was firm beneath his fingertips, firmer than any cactus bark had the right to be. It felt almost like wood, but not the wood of a plant. Something denser, something sealed, something hidden. He brushed away a thin layer of sand blown against the base, revealing a faint, unnatural seam beneath the hardened bark. The air around him shifted, the breeze slowing as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Raven let out another low growl. "No," Ethan whispered. "You're right. This isn't natural." He circled the cactus slowly, taking in every angle. The bulge wasn't random. It had clear, subtle edges. And behind those edges, something waited. Something that had been deliberately placed there years ago, maybe even decades. Ethan felt the cold ripple of recognition run through him. He had seen methods like this before in places far from home. Smugglers hiding data in false walls, insurgents sealing weapons into the frames of abandoned buildings, people forced to bury their intentions inside the most unlikely structures just to keep them safe for one more day. But a cactus? This was new. The desert wind brushed against his skin, warm and dry. Ethan rested a hand lightly against the tough bark, feeling the silent mass beneath. Raven inched closer, touching her shoulder to his leg, as if reminding him not to get too close. He pulled his hand away. "Someone hid something in you a long time ago," he murmured, "and they didn't come back for it." The thought sank heavily into him. Whoever had done this must have been either desperate or meticulous, possibly both, and whatever was inside the cactus had survived through decades of scorching summers and relentless storms. He stood up slowly, his mind sifting through possibilities. Old cartel activity from the 80s, a lost courier, a runaway, a soldier, a victim, a criminal, someone who needed a hiding place they believed would outlast everything. Raven pressed against him again. Ethan took one last long look at the strange bulge before turning away. The desert felt uneasy now, not dangerous, but watchful. On the walk home, Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear behind the boulders or walk out of the fading shadows. Raven stayed closer than usual, her steps aligned with his, her ears twitching at every sound. Even the wind seemed to move differently, drifting through the cacti in slow, cautious sighs. Back in his small house, Ethan locked the door out of habit. He stood by the window for several minutes, looking out at the dim horizon. The desert silence pressed against the glass, thicker than before. Something about that cactus lingered in him, a gnawing curiosity mixed with a veteran's instinct that nothing concealed that carefully should ever be ignored. Raven paced once, twice, then lay near the door, head lifted, senses sharp. "You feel it too," Ethan said quietly. He took out the photos he'd snapped on his phone and studied them late into the evening. The shape, the unnatural lines, the slight curvature along one edge, the strange density beneath the bark. It wasn't just an oddity. It was a message sent forward through time. When Ethan finally went to bed, he lay awake, listening to the shifting air outside, hearing echoes of the desert he thought he understood. But tonight, the quiet carried something new, a faint thread of a story that had waited decades to surface. And he knew, with the steady certainty of a man who had learned to trust his instincts, that he would return to the cactus in the morning. There were some secrets the desert could hold forever, and others that refused to stay buried. Ethan rose before dawn, long before the first pale band of light stretched across the desert horizon. Sleep had hovered over him in restless fragments, broken by shifting thoughts and the persistent feeling that the saguaro, with the strange bulge, had not finished speaking to him. The house was cool in the early morning darkness, the air holding a thin bite left over from the night. Raven was already awake when he stepped into the living room. She stood near the door, tail still, watching him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand his decision before he even voiced it. "You're coming with me," he murmured, fastening the worn strap of his pack. "You wouldn't let me go alone anyway." Raven gave a quiet, affirming huff, then fell into step beside him as he stepped out into the pre-dawn chill. The desert greeted them with a low murmur of wind brushing over stone, carrying the scent of cold sand and the faint, earthy notes of creosote. The sky was deep blue, almost black, scattered with the last fading stars. For a moment, Ethan let the silence settle through him. It felt different today, heavier, as if the land itself anticipated what they were walking toward. He took the same route as the day before, moving with steady purpose. The ground crunched beneath his boots, and the world brightened slowly with each step they took toward the wash. Raven walked close, not darting ahead as she sometimes did. Every few seconds, she lifted her head to sniff the air, ears twitching. Ethan kept his hand near her shoulder, feeling more connected to her watchfulness than ever. He had no illusions about what they might find today. The desert had an uncanny way of revealing secrets that weren't meant to stay hidden forever. As the sky lightened into a muted rose, the saguaros loomed up ahead, vast silhouettes etched against the dawn. The giant cactus with the unnatural bulge came into view soon after, its shape undeniable even from a distance. Ethan felt his shoulders tense. Raven slowed her pace as they approached, her rumbling growl rising low in her throat once again. Whatever she sensed, it unsettled her deeply. Ethan knelt beside the massive plant, scanning the ground, then ran his fingers over the same hardened swell he had touched the previous day. The surface was as unyielding as before. His knife wouldn't be enough this time. He retrieved a small folding saw from his pack, the teeth sharpened and ready, and slipped on a pair of work gloves. Raven positioned herself behind him, facing outward, guarding their perimeter. "Keep watch," he whispered softly. As he pressed the saw's teeth against the thickened bark, Ethan felt a flicker of unease. The idea of cutting into something living, especially something as ancient as a saguaro, felt almost sacrilegious. But whatever, or whoever, was sealed inside, had been placed there for a reason, and leaving it hidden now felt wrong. The saw bit into the dense outer layer with far more resistance than he had expected. Each pull scraped and grated through hardened tissue that had formed over decades. Thin curls of pale dust drifted down with each stroke, catching the morning light like ash. The scent rising from the cut surprised him. It was dry but strangely rich, a blend of plant resin, old wood, and something faintly metallic. It reminded him of ancient, forgotten places, bunkers sealed for years, old storerooms cracked open for the first time, caches he had encountered abroad, where time had preserved things almost too well. He paused occasionally to brush away debris, revealing more of the cavity just beneath the surface. As he worked, He felt the cactus's shape respond subtly, its rigidity shifting under the pressure. Raven suddenly stiffened. Ethan heard it too. A faint disturbance in the air, not close, but not far enough to dismiss. It sounded like something brushing through low brush, too heavy to be wind alone. He lifted his head, listening, but after several seconds, everything fell still again. Raven didn't relax immediately, but she didn't bark either. Ethan waited another moment, and then returned to the task. Soon the saw teeth met something different beneath the bark. Instead of resisting like wood, the blade tapped against a harder, smoother surface. Ethan cleared more fibers away, exposing the faintest glint of metal. He leaned closer, heart slow and heavy in his chest. The dull shine didn't belong to any natural growth. It belonged to something manufactured. He widened the opening, careful but determined, peeling back the hardened layers. The shape beneath became clearer, a corner of a rectangular box, edges softened by time, but unmistakably human-made. The metal surface showed faint pitting and discoloration, as if it had endured countless seasons sealed inside the cactus. The front bore a shallow dent, a mark deep enough to suggest force, maybe a strike or impact long before the cactus grew around it. "Well," Ethan whispered, "you didn't come here by accident." He slipped his fingers along the edge, trying to get a better grip, but the box was still embedded firmly in the plant. He needed to cut away more. As he lifted the saw again, Raven snapped her head toward the north. Her ears shot up, her body tensing like a coiled spring. Ethan froze and followed her gaze. In the distance, just beyond a rise of rocks, a faint glint of sunlight flashed off something smooth glass, metal, or both. It vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the undulating terrain. His pulse thudded once, slow and heavy. This was not the natural shimmer of heat or wind. It was the reflection of a windshield, a vehicle, and it hadn't been there before. Raven's growl deepened as the realization settled in. Someone else was out here. Someone who either already knew about the cactus or had followed him without his noticing. The desert was vast, but not empty. Ethan returned to the task with newfound urgency, slicing deeper until he could push both hands beneath the exposed lip of the metal box. It took several wrenching tugs before the ancient plant finally surrendered its grip with a brittle crack. The box slid free, heavier than he expected, and for one suspended moment, he feared it might slip from his hands. He steadied it, quickly wrapping it in a cloth from his pack to conceal the reflective surface. "You've been waiting a long time," he murmured to the box under his breath, not sure why the words came out like that. Before he could examine it further, Raven barked sharply, her body angled toward the distant ridge. The bark wasn't her usual warning. It was sharper, urgent, a signal he knew from the field. Someone is coming. He reacted without thinking, as he had been trained to do. He swept away the surrounding debris, kicking loose sand over the signs of his work. He slipped the saw and gloves back into his pack, slung the wrapped metal box under his arm, and scanned the terrain. Raven was already beside him, her eyes locked on the rise of rocks. They moved quickly but silently, angling away from the cactus toward a cluster of boulders that provided a natural shield. Ethan crouched low, hiding behind a sandstone outcrop, and peered back toward the clearing. A moment later, a dark vehicle rolled slowly into view, tire treads pressing new tracks into the sand. The windows were tinted. The engine's rumble carried across the open space in a low, deliberate growl. The vehicle stopped mere feet from the Saguaro. Someone stepped out, a man, tall, broad, wearing desert boots and a dark jacket inappropriate for the heat. He walked toward the cactus with purpose, touching the bark where Ethan had cut, studying the area. He looked over his shoulder once, scanning the horizon. Ethan and Raven remained perfectly still, hidden behind the rocks. Raven's breathing was quiet, practiced. She had learned stealth the same way Ethan had, through necessity, not instruction. The man crouched and inspected the ground. Then he straightened and rested a hand on the cactus, as if confirming something. He knew. He wasn't here by chance. Ethan watched the man return to the vehicle, speak to someone inside, and finally drive away, the tires leaving a fresh trail in the sand that pointed toward a direction Ethan had never seen a tourist or hiker travel. He remained motionless long after the sound faded. Only when he was certain the man was gone did he rise, lifting the metal box with a grim sense of purpose. Raven pressed close to him, not out of fear, but readiness. They moved quickly back toward home, letting the desert swallow their tracks as best it could. Every shift in the wind felt sharper. Every distant rock formation felt like a potential lookout point. Ethan knew better than to pretend this was still an isolated mystery. He had triggered something the moment he cut into the cactus. Something had begun moving in the shadows. By the time they reached his home, the sun was high enough that the heat pushed down on his shoulders like a weight. He closed the door behind them, set the deadbolt, then pulled curtains over the windows. Only when the room dimmed did he set the metal box on the kitchen table. He stared at it for a long time, Raven sitting silently at his side. He didn't open it yet. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood the gravity of sealed secrets. The box had been hidden for decades inside a living fortress. Something in it had been important enough for someone to die before returning. And now someone else wanted it badly enough to follow him without hesitation. The desert had given him a secret that was never meant to resurface. Ethan brushed the metal surface with one thumb, feeling the grooves, the dents, the old coldness of it. Raven laid her head gently on his knee, a quiet reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. Whoever hid the box had trusted the desert to guard it. Now the desert had passed that burden on to him, and Ethan knew whatever waited inside had changed his quiet life forever. The metal box sat on Ethan's kitchen table, like a piece of the past torn loose and dropped violently into the present. The faint morning glow slipped through a sliver between the curtains, casting a thin line of light across its surface. It revealed the worn edges, the hairline scratches along the side, the dent that hinted at a violent impact long before it ever touched the inside of a cactus. Raven lay on the floor beside him, her body taut despite her stillness, her ears rising at every tiny creak of the house settling. The tension in her echoed the tension inside him. Both of them understood that the quiet of their life had been shattered the moment the box left the desert. Ethan ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly as he sat opposite the object. The events of the morning replayed in his mind with sharp, unavoidable clarity. The sound of the saw biting into hardened cactus flesh, the metallic sheen beneath the bark, the sudden appearance of the vehicle on the ridge, the man inspecting the cactus with the solemnity of someone visiting a grave. Ethan had known danger intimately in his life, had felt its presence before it ever materialized into bullets, or fire, or the screams of men. The sensation now was the same, not immediate violence, but the unmistakable pressure of the world constricting around something he had disturbed. Raven lifted her head and looked at him, the silent question in her eyes asking if he was ready. He didn't answer verbally. Instead, he reached for the box and carefully turned it. The latch was aged and crusted with the grime of decades, its edges stiff under his grip. He worked it open with slow, deliberate pressure, careful not to damage whatever lay inside. The latch gave with a muted click. Ethan hesitated a moment, allowing his breath to steady before he lifted the lid. The scent that drifted out was old dust, metal, and the faint musk of paper that had been kept from air and light for too many years. The interior was lined with crumbling padding, discolored to a deep brown. Within the box lay a neat cluster of items placed with deliberate care. as if the person who sealed them away had understood the gravity of what they were preserving. The first object Ethan removed was a small identification tag, a dog tag. He turned it between his fingers, feeling the chill of the metal seep into his skin. The name had partially worn off, but enough remained to read the initials. It wasn't someone he recognized, but the presence of a soldier's tag tucked inside a cactus in the desert struck him harder than he expected. It was a personal mark, not contraband. Someone hadn't hidden wealth or weapons. They had hidden themselves, or at least the story of who they were. Under the dog tag lay a journal. Its cover was cracked, the leather brittle with age. The edges were darkened, as if touched by fire. Ethan opened it slowly, careful not to tear the delicate pages. The handwriting inside was jagged but legible, a mix of English and Spanish, the two languages weaving together in a desperate effort to communicate. He read a few lines, his heart tightening as he absorbed the words. The writer spoke of operations along the border, of corruption that reached higher than anyone dared admit publicly, of missing people whose names he listed in cramped script, of cargo that transported far more than drugs. Human lives were smuggled children, families, under the watch of men whose badges should have guaranteed their safety. The writer had been part of this machine until he refused to stay silent. The journal held confessions and locations, dates and names that echoed with the weight of crimes meant to be buried in endless desert miles. Ethan closed the book for a moment, letting the enormity of what he'd seen settle into him. The box wasn't the work of a low-level courier. It was the hiding place of someone who risked everything to expose a network of predators. The kind of person who likely died for trying. The desert had taken their body, but the cactus had protected their truth. Raven shifted restlessly, pushing her nose against Ethan's leg. He set the journal aside with a reverence that felt instinctive and reached for the next item. A photograph lay beneath the journal, its edges curled with age. When he lifted it, a fine layer of dust fluttered into the air. The photo depicted a man in his late 20s or early 30s, holding a toddler in his arms. The man's smile was warm, open, the kind of expression that suggested hope. The child wore a sun hat, reaching out to the camera with a small hand. Ethan stared at the picture longer than he intended, tracing the outline of the child's fingers, the man's posture, the faint desert ridge visible in the background. The man in the picture was likely the writer of the journal, a father, someone who had hoped to return. Ethan placed the photo gently beside the tag and journal. The last item inside the box was a small, oblong container made of metal heavy, sealed with tiny screws along the edges. It looked like something that belonged to an early era of digital storage. Ethan turned it in his hands, recognizing the design vaguely from outdated intelligence devices he had seen in the military. It would require specialized equipment to access. By the time he closed the box, his pulse felt like a steady drumbeat in his ears. He sat back, trying to piece together the emerging picture. A soldier or agent had uncovered a trafficking ring. He had documented everything. Names, routes, dates, and hidden the evidence inside a young cactus. Then he had vanished. Killed. Lost. Forgotten except by the desert. Raven suddenly stiffened again, rising to her feet. She padded to the window, her muscles locked in grim attention. Ethan froze. The sound of an engine hum drifted faintly through the glass, soft but present. He moved to the window carefully, pushing the curtain just enough to peer outside. The same dark vehicle from the desert sat at the entrance of his property, just past the ring of gravel that marked the boundary. Its windows were still tinted. No one stepped out, but the vehicle didn't move either. It simply sat there, humming like a patient predator. Raven growled deeply, the sound vibrating in her chest. Ethan's instincts sharpened instantly. He stepped away from the window and turned off the lights, even though it was still daylight. His mind shifted into the tactical logic he had hoped to leave behind. He moved through his house quickly, securing doors, checking angles, mapping lines of sight from windows. Raven followed him, her movements as silent as shadow. He returned to the table and pulled an old military rucksack from the closet. Inside was a small assortment of tools he kept only because he could not bring himself to throw them away. A compact flashlight, a strip of fabric for bandaging, a rusted multi-tool, and a length of cord. He didn't have weapons. The past had taught him that carrying them in civilian life only invited ghosts, but he could improvise if necessary. He placed the journal and the metal container inside a hidden compartment in the bedroom wall. Only Raven saw where he hid them. She sat and watched him seal the panel, her eyes steady, as if memorizing the movement. When he finished, she brushed her head against his leg again, nudging him toward the kitchen. Her body remained coiled with tension. The sound outside grew softer, then cut off entirely. The quiet that followed was far too sharp to belong to nature. Ethan moved toward the back of the house to check the other windows. Raven beat him there, staring intensely through the small gap in the curtains. He stood beside her and looked out. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Someone, a silhouette, was walking along the side of the house, near the shed. Slowly, carefully. He stepped away from the window, breathing evenly. Panic never helped. These were likely the same men searching the cactus. They hadn't come out of curiosity. They wanted the box, and if they knew he had it, they wouldn't leave until they had what they wanted. He had the advantage of home terrain, but they had numbers, and possibly weapons. Raven's tail dropped, her body lowering into a defensive stance. Ethan gave her a hand signal they had practiced years ago. She moved to the far corner of the room, low to the ground, ready to react. The knock at the front door when it finally came was gentle, almost polite. Ethan didn't answer. A second knock followed, harder this time. Then silence. A long, deliberate silence. He waited, breath steady, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. When the quiet finally broke, it wasn't a knock. It was the faint crunch of footsteps outside, circling, testing windows, trying to find a way in. Ethan reached for the one advantage he had, the vastness of the desert outside. The land had once shielded secrets. Perhaps it could shield him, too. He grabbed the rucksack, loaded it with essentials, and gave Raven a low command. She followed him as he crept toward the back door. He opened it quietly, stepping into the late afternoon heat. The horizon shimmered ahead in muted gold. The desert was waiting. They disappeared into its vastness. Only once they were far enough from the house did Ethan speak, his voice low, almost breathless. "We're not giving them what they came for. We're seeing this through." Raven moved ahead of him, guiding them toward a rocky outcrop she often used as a lookout. Ethan followed, knowing he needed information and support. Someone trustworthy. Someone outside the tangled web of those who wanted the evidence erased. He knew exactly who that person was, a journalist who had chased ghosts of the border wars for decades, a man who had survived too much to be silenced and who would not ignore what Ethan carried. The desert wind rose as they climbed the rocks, brushing grains of sand across his boots. Behind him, in the distance, his house sat small and solitary against the horizon. He knew it wouldn't be safe again, but that didn't matter. He had chosen his path, and somewhere inside the desert's breath, the truth waited to be carried forward, just as the cactus had carried it for 40 long years. Ethan placed a hand on Raven's back, steadying himself as they reached the top of the ridge. The sun dipped lower, casting the desert in crimson light. For the first time since opening the box, he felt something shift. Not relief, not fear, but purpose. The desert had remembered the truth. Now it had chosen him to reveal it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Watch our other videos to continue the journey, and share this one with someone who would enjoy it.